The Second Vatican Council, called by Pope John the 23rd in the 1960s, brought about great changes in the ordinary day-to-day lives of Catholics all over the world. And it came at an opportune moment in history because there was a new spirit abroad in society at large, but it also affected the life of the Church. And it was a critical, sceptical spirit of what has been called modernism or relativism. Nothing and nobody escaped its judgment. Nothing seemed secure or sacred anymore. People felt free to challenge well-established and widely held beliefs and practices, secular and religious. Liberalism was the order of the day, and so it seemed whoever shouted louder and longer would be heeded and would be seen to be giving voice to the truth. It was their truth, of course, their outlook and scale of priorities, their views and opinions on all sorts of ethical, moral and social issues. The bishops and theologians from across the world who gathered in Rome for the council wanted to let the voice of Christ ring out loudly and clearly among the cacophony of the world's voices, to proclaim afresh the gospel, the good news, the truth that God our Father wants all people to hear, his truth, for that is the truth he promises that will set us free and guide us safely through this life to the next. And that gospel is not just a message to be heard. It's a summons to a new way of life, the life demonstrated by Jesus himself while here in the flesh, the life he wants to live still in the new body he's been fashioning and forming since the resurrection. That is the Church, us, you and me and all who choose to listen and to take part. Sadly, not everyone in the Church responded to the Council and its call for renewal. Many saw it as a betrayal, in fact, of the past, a break with the past, and a readiness to listen to the voices of the world and to engage with them in conversation. They would have preferred to draw up the drawbridge, as it were, and withdraw into the security afforded by the Church, which they saw as a fortress-like church, and leave the world to its own devices. Now that cannot be what God wants. So we have to ask, what is the way forward? Matthew gives us a much needed guidance in his gospel, which this year, in our weekly liturgy on Sundays, is being read to us for reflection and active response. And that's quite appropriate, because in fact Matthew was facing a very similar situation in the 80s of the first century to the situation that we find ourselves in today. Over the 50 years or so since the world-changing events of that first Easter when Jesus rose from the dead and the subsequent spread of the gospel across the Middle East, the religious landscape had changed rapidly and dramatically. In the year 70 AD, the unthinkable had happened. Jerusalem, the holy city, and the great temple itself, symbol of God's presence and focus of religious life for God's people for centuries, had been destroyed by the Romans and the inhabitants massacred. The Pharisees survived. The Jewish authorities relocated themselves to a new centre in a town near the coast, north of Jerusalem, called Jamnia. And they then had to focus not on the temple, but on the local synagogues, which were and became more so centres for prayer and worship and instruction for the people of God. Where the temple had once been the place where sacrifice had been offered to God, now sacrifice was replaced by prayer and instruction. For the rabbis who now operated from Jamnia, the emergence of the earliest Christians, what we might call the new kids on the block, was too much to swallow. They were branded as traitors, renegades, who had betrayed the faith of their fathers, of their ancestors, by giving their allegiance to Jesus and his teaching. And these Christians were beginning to organise themselves into small communities, and to add insult to injury, were openly welcoming non-Jews, Gentiles, into their midst to share their life of prayer and worship, and their commitment to establishing a more gentle, just and merciful world. This was a step too far for the Jewish authorities, and in the late 1st century they issued a formal condemnation and a curse on the new movement, and that was the parting of the ways for Jews and Christians. But the original suspicion and ill feeling would continue to dog them, and still does, even up to our present day. But that was the situation facing Matthew and the small network of communities that were springing up and spreading across the coastal countries around the Eastern Mediterranean. They had to be assured that they were not betraying their tradition and their Jewish roots and the rich heritage of faith as God's people. Matthew's response was really inspired and gives the gospel he wrote its unique character. Matthew set out in his gospel to show that there was in fact no break with tradition, but actual continuity with tradition. And what Jesus had done in the original events of the Exodus from Egypt for one people, the Jews, had been intended as a blueprint outlining who God was, how he operates, and what his ultimate plan was, not just for one people, but for the whole human race. So what Moses did for that motley group of very different, unrelated and headstrong Semitic tribes, Jesus ultimately would do for the various races and different religions and ethnic and social groupings that make up the human race. And he did this in his own flesh and will continue to do since his resurrection through the church. They will act with him as God's spokesman, and their mission is to help develop and nurture a sense of our shared humanity. We all have the same Father, and every human being is a sister or a brother and deserves to be treated as such. We live, therefore, the Exodus now in our own lives. It was on that Exodus that God revealed that he would personally always be with his people, and promised that there were greater things still to come. That promise is being fulfilled even now, Matthew is saying. God is still present. The name of this child is Emmanuel, God with us. And what was happening in the coming of Jesus Christ had been outlined already in the original Exodus. And so these small Christian communities were there to make available to the whole human race the plan of God and the possibility of becoming a part of that plan. It is God who first worked through the Jewish community, who is now working in and through these smaller Christian communities. And Matthew addresses them, and he alone uses the word ecclesia for them. In Greek, the word describes, the work is from two Greek words, from kalein, the verb, to summon or gather, and the preposition ek, meaning out of. The English word for ecclesia is church, the gathering of those who choose to listen for the voice of Christ and who are committed to the life and the lifestyle demonstrated by him himself during his earthly life in his own body, and that he wants now to demonstrate in the life and lifestyle of his faithful, loyal members of his living body now, the church. So Matthew has been able to challenge his readers then, and he still does today through the words of the gospel that reach us, to a renewed confidence. He presents Jesus in his gospel as the very antithesis of the traditional Jewish authorities then and their equivalent today. Those who do not practice what they preach. That's hypocrisy. So Matthew is able to say, don't listen to them. And the same is equally true for anyone in the Christian tradition who says one thing and does another. They are not credible spokespeople. In chapter 23, verse 8 of his gospel, he warns disciples never to hanker after the honour of being treated as God's spokesman. Never allow yourself to be called rabbi, since you have only one master and you are all brothers and sisters. The one master is Christ. He alone is to be trusted, for he practiced what he preached, and he still does. He never asks any disciple, whether lay or ordained, to do what he himself was not prepared to do. And so when we begin the season of Lent this year, the gospel for the first 2 Sundays is taken from Matthew's gospel. So we have to ask, what is Matthew in this gospel asking us all, the community of disciples, the whole church, to do during this time of Lent? It's something that Jesus himself chose to do. In other words, it's part of that great tradition. And the answer is clear and direct. From his own experience of being human, Jesus wants us to learn how to recognize and deal with the reality of temptation. Now that shouldn't really surprise us, because temptation and the damage it can cause to our significant relationships in life with God, with one another, with ourselves, is a regular feature in the long story of human history itself, but also in the story of faith, as revealed to us beginning in the great tradition of the Exodus, the founding story of those 40 years spent by God's people in the wilderness after God brought them out of Egypt. And he offered them a new dignity and a new life in a new land of their own. But sadly, as we know, God's people then as now thought that that was not enough. You could say there's no pleasing God's people. They were never satisfied, and they were prepared to look for more from whoever or whatever appeared to offer it, thinking it might cost them less. We never do learn, do we? You know the prayer of St. Thomas More, Lord, grant me a holy heart. He says in it, Master, grant me a heart that knows nothing of boredom, weeping and sighing. You know, there was and there still is lots of that in the original desert experience. But More goes on to say, let me not be too concerned with the bothersome thing I call myself. There's the problem that we all have to face as disciples. The bothersome thing I call myself, me. One of the first lessons every human being has to learn is that the world does not revolve around me, that I don't have an inbuilt entitlement. There are boundaries, rules, other people's rights and needs and sensitivities to be recognised and respected, which means that we have to learn, each one of us, to say no to ourselves and to accept that when we're not inclined to say no, we need others perhaps to say it to us and indeed perhaps for us. But there's a bit of us that doesn't like being told no. You can't. Every parent knows that and knows that the surest way to make a child do something that he or she shouldn't be doing is to tell them, don't do that. And that's really the lesson of today's first reading from Genesis, the story of original sin. Sin in its origin, how it begins. It's the forbidden fruit. Every tree was there, given them by God to be enjoyed, except one, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. It was to God alone to identify what is good and what is evil. And we have to accept that. But there's the temptation to take a chance, have a go. What's to lose? And of course, as the book of Genesis tells us, the answer was everything. The sweetness turns quickly sour. It dawns on you and can gnaw away at you that you have overstepped a boundary. You have abused someone, something, a trust, a love, a friendship, a commitment. And of course, one thing inevitably leads to another. The die is cast. You're caught, enmeshed in what Sir Walter Scott calls a tangled web of deceit in his poem Marmion. Pope Francis recently encouraged preachers to leave their hearers with an image. So here's an image of a web, a spider's web, designed to catch the curious, careless fly that comes too close, and then there's no escape. Every attempt to free itself only entangles it more. That's what sin does. Today, in the first Sunday of Lent, we have the opportunity to enter with Jesus into our own desert experience and to reflect on how temptation features in our own lives and to ask who tempts us, what tempts us, and how do we react and how do we deal with it. What therefore does the gospel ask of me today? And the answer is clear. We must be prepared to face temptation and know how best to deal with it. And temptation and facing temptation is part of the story of faith. In fact, it's more than that. It's essential to the development of faith, because temptation brings home to us just how fickle we can be at times, especially at moments in life when critical decisions have to be made, or to bring home to us just how capable we all are of blowing it, as we say, and causing havoc, not just for ourselves, but for everybody else. Temptation in itself is not a sign of moral weakness or carelessness. It might be. But that is to suggest that we should be above that sort of thing. We should know better. Rather, we are invited to see temptation as a signal alerting us to the dangers that faith has to face. The danger of letting ourselves be seduced or cajoled into a course of action that is not life-giving, but destructive, death-dealing for others and ultimately for ourselves. And that's what we identify as sin, the result of saying yes to temptation. But we need to remember that until we say yes, knowingly, deliberately, without care for the consequences, there is no sin. And it's important to stress that, because sometimes the strength and the frequency of temptations that people have to face leave them feeling that they've brought it on themselves, that they don't deserve God's mercy and forgiveness, that they're not worth saving. But that's the ultimate temptation, to think that they are beyond redemption, and that's despair. That's why we, all of us, need to hear today's gospel and to know that Jesus himself was tempted, and he wasn't play acting at being human. He was experiencing what it means to be fully human. The letter to the Hebrews in chapter 4 puts it in bold letters, if you like, so that there's no misunderstanding. We must never let go of the faith that we have professed, for it is not as if we had a high priest who was incapable of feeling our weaknesses with us, but we have one who has been tempted in every way that we are, though he is without sin. So let us be confident then in approaching the throne of grace and find grace when we are in need of help. I thought it might be helpful then to zoom in on this first Sunday of Lent and take a brief, closer, dispassionate look at what's actually going on when we find ourselves being tempted. According to the traditional wisdom of the spiritual writers, there are 3 phases or stages in every temptation, and we can test the truth of this from our own experience. First, there's suggestion. Then there's awareness of pleasure or appeal. And then there's consent. Let's look at each very briefly. Suggestion. We find ourselves suddenly faced with something or someone that holds a certain fascination for us, and we feel drawn to experience this for ourselves. We begin to imagine what it might be like if we were to have a similar experience in our own lives. And we picture ourselves doing something or maybe not doing something. And that picture, once it's into our head, it pops up again and again. And often at the most inappropriate times. How often people have said, it's at sacred moments even, when I'm preparing for Holy Communion, that's when the worst thoughts and feelings sometimes assail me. It's important to remember that still there is no sin, no matter how apparently explicit or inappropriate the suggestion might be. I think we have to accept that we are always going to be bombarded, whether we like it or not, with all sorts of unwelcome and even harmful suggestions because of the world we live in. There is an all-pervasive influence from advertising and entertainment and the social media that assails our senses, and we can't go around with our eyes closed, refusing to acknowledge what's presented to us, what's facing us, what's sometimes pushed into our faces. And the suggestion comes that we're really missing out on what's available, but still no sin. The second stage is we become aware that there might be some advantage in this for ourselves. It appeals to us. It suggests pleasure at some level, and almost against our better judgment, we toy with the possibility of saying yes, where we haven't yet said yes. It's then, the situation is then what Paul describes as the flesh warring against the spirit. Still, there is no sin, although the danger increases as we shilly-shally, that we will ultimately move into top gear and into the third stage and give consent. And that's when we give in. We throw caution to the wind. We say, what the hell? We go for it. We say yes. We cross the line and we sin. The gospel today tells us that Jesus faced the suggestions. He appreciated the advantages presented to himself of compromise and cutting corners, of minimizing the level of commitment to the Father's will and so avoiding perhaps too much personal suffering. In other words, he was tempted to accept that he might be able to say, do as I say, but not as I do, which would have made him no better than the run-of-the-mill local Pharisees. But Jesus said no, and he wants to help us to do the same. as the letter to the Hebrews in chapter 5 verse 9 reminds us, although he was Son, he learned to obey through suffering, but having been made perfect, he became for us who obey him the source of eternal salvation. We must learn to obey his promptings and say no. Reflecting on this scene of the temptations of Jesus, which we shouldn't see as a single one-off incident, but as an ongoing element in our own faith journey, because it was an element in the faith journey of Jesus himself. And reflecting on that, the spiritual writers offer some practical advice on what to do when severely tempted. And there are three things in particular we need to take note of. First of all, and the best thing to do, is to build up resistance. Create habits of the heart, as it were, that will almost automatically kick in when we see the danger signals, when the red light goes on. And that's why Jesus asks us to do what he did. Watch and pray. Be vigilant, on your guard. Recognize the warning signs, what traditionally we've called the occasions of sin, and don't go too close or your fingers will be burned. And secondly, develop a strategy. Don't go at it all with the same energy and strength of purpose. St. Francis de Sales once advised us not to waste energy on what he called the trifling temptations of everyday life, the little things that nag at us, the vexations, the little vanities, and the jealousies, and the impatience, and the quick word, that they flit around us like gnats, he says, or flies. Swat them away and don't give them the time of day, as it were, and don't bother with them. And after you've swatted them away, just say a quick thanks to God and get on with life. It's when you're faced with serious temptation, where there's a lot at stake, when it's life-giving or death-dealing, that's when you have to do something, and you have to act. And the spiritual writers tell us, act promptly, move away, either physically or mentally. In other words, act promptly. And act energetically. Don't be half-hearted and shilly-shally and toy with the temptation. Say quite clearly, get behind me, Satan. And don't let your guard down too quickly. Persevere. In other words, remember Matthew's parable in chapter 12, verse 45, about the unclean spirit which goes out of a person, wanders through the wilderness looking for a place to rest, and not finding one, returns to where it came from, and finding it unoccupied, swept and tidied, it goes off and collects 7 other spirits, and they go in and set up house, and the person ends up being worse than before. If and when the temptation passes, if you have survived, resisted, then thank God and ask him to stay always with you. But if you have given in, don't lose heart or let anyone convince you that you'll never be rid of sin. You will if you throw yourself on God's mercy and ask forgiveness again and again if need be, and that forgiveness will be granted again and again. And that's the good news. Finally, the story of the child who was asked, what's the best way to deal with temptation? And she said, when the devil comes knocking at the door of my heart, I send Jesus to answer it. And when the devil sees Jesus, he says, oops, sorry, wrong home. Think about it.